The small roadside cafe was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the late afternoon sun streaming through dusty windows. Malik Washington, an 80-year-old man, sat thoughtfully by the window, his trembling hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. His white hair framed a face marked with lines of experience, yet his eyes still held the sharp resolve of a war veteran. This cafe was his refuge, a place he came to every afternoon, sitting at the same table, staring out at the parking lot and reflecting on the years gone by. But today, the peaceful rhythm of his routine was broken. From the parking lot, a low rumble began to echo. Malik's keen ears caught the unmistakable growl of motorcycle engines, a sound that had grown too familiar in the past months. A group of bikers, clad in leather jackets and adorned with tattoos, pulled up outside, their roaring machines drowning out the cafe's usual hum. Malik sighed and glanced at the cafe owner, a middle-aged man named Chuck, who stood nervously behind the counter. Chuck shot Malik a worried look, as if to say, "Here we go again." The bikers stomped in, their heavy boots clattering on the wooden floor. One of them, a burly man with a scruffy beard and a menacing grin, scanned the room and locked eyes on Malik. Well, look who we have here," the man sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Old man Malik, still nursing that coffee like it's all you've got?" The others laughed, their jeers bouncing off the walls. Malik didn't flinch. He sipped his coffee, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Leave him alone, Jack," Chuck spoke up, his voice shaky but firm. "He's just minding his own business." Jack turned toward Chuck, his grin widening. "Relax, Chuck. We're just having a little fun." Then, turning back to Malik, he leaned closer. "But you know, old man, this is our town now. Maybe it's time you started showing some respect." Malik placed his cup down slowly, the ceramic clinking softly against the saucer. His voice, though quiet, carried an undeniable weight. "You boys don't know a thing about respect." The cafe fell silent, the air thick with tension. Malik's calm demeanor only seemed to provoke the bikers further. Jack straightened up, his grin now replaced with a scowl. "You've got a mouth on you, old-timer," he growled. "Maybe we need to teach you some manners." Malik leaned back in his chair, his face impassive. But beneath the table, his hand subtly reached for his phone. "You can try," he said evenly, "but you might not like what happens next." The bikers exchanged glances, their amusement fading into confusion. Malik pressed a button on his phone, his expression unreadable. "Who are you calling, Grandpa?" Jack taunted, but his voice held a flicker of uncertainty. Malik's eyes met Jack's, and for the first time, a hint of a smile played on his lips. "Where are you watching from? Please publicly comment your opinion to let us know. Please like and subscribe to the channel." The bikers lingered in the cafe, their laughter subdued as an uneasy silence settled over the room. Jack crossed his arms, his scowl deepening, while the others tried to mask their uncertainty with forced grins. Malik remained composed, his phone still in his hand. He had made the call, but he didn't say a word, not yet. The only sound was the faint ringing on the other end of the line. "You think calling someone is gonna save you, old man?" Jack sneered, stepping closer. "Nobody's coming to help you." Malik didn't respond immediately. His calmness only made the bikers more uneasy. Then, the phone clicked, and a voice answered. "Hello, Grandpa? Is everything okay?" The voice on the other end was firm yet youthful, belonging to a man whose tone carried authority. Malik's lips curled into a faint smile as he spoke. "Ethan," he said softly, "we've got a situation at the cafe. You know what to do." There was a pause, and then Ethan's voice hardened. "Understood. I'll handle it." The bikers exchanged puzzled looks, their bravado faltering. Jack tried to keep up his tough act. "Ethan, huh? Your grandson? What's he gonna do? Show up with a walker?" Malik finally stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. He looked Jack in the eye, his gaze steady and unyielding. "You're about to find out, son." Chuck, still standing behind the counter, watched the exchange with growing curiosity. He knew Malik wasn't a man to make empty threats, but he also didn't fully understand what the old veteran was capable of. Minutes felt like hours as the bikers grew restless. The tension in the room was palpable. One of the younger bikers, clearly nervous, whispered, "Maybe we should go, Jack. This doesn't feel right." Jack shot him a glare. "We're not going anywhere." Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of powerful engines rumbled outside. The bikers turned their heads toward the parking lot, their smug expressions vanishing. A convoy of sleek black SUVs pulled in, their polished exteriors gleaming under the fading sunlight. The vehicles came to a halt with precision, their doors opening in unison. Out stepped Ethan, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 30s, dressed sharply in a tailored suit. His presence radiated authority, and his piercing gaze swept across the scene. Behind him emerged several others, all equally imposing, their expressions serious and their movements coordinated. The bikers froze, their confidence evaporating. Jack's bravado crumbled as he stammered, "Who the hell are you?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he approached Malik, his respect for the older man evident in the way he straightened his posture. "Grandpa," he said, his voice calm yet filled with concern, "are you okay?" Malik nodded, a faint smile on his face. "I'm fine, Ethan. But these boys here seem to think they own the place." Ethan turned to face the bikers, his expression hardening. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice low but commanding. "A very big mistake." Jack tried to regain his composure, puffing out his chest. "And who are you supposed to be?" Ethan took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "The man who's going to teach you the meaning of consequences." The room fell silent, the weight of Ethan's words hanging heavy in the air. Jack shifted uneasily, his earlier bravado now a memory. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. Ethan's presence commanded attention, and the silent men who stood behind him radiated authority. "I don't know who you think you are," Jack blustered, trying to salvage his ego. "But you don't scare me." Ethan tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "That's a shame. Because you should be." The other bikers exchanged worried glances, sensing the shift in power. Jack, however, wasn't one to back down easily. "You think you can just show up here and—" Ethan raised a hand, silencing Jack mid-sentence. "Enough." His voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. He turned his attention to the cafe patrons, who were watching the scene unfold with bated breath. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. Please enjoy your meals. This won't take long." His calm assurance had the desired effect. The tension eased slightly among the onlookers, but for the bikers, it only intensified. Malik, who had remained seated, finally broke his silence. "Ethan, these boys here think respect is optional. Maybe they need a reminder of how the world works." Ethan's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the mask of composure slipped, revealing a flash of anger. "They will learn, Grandpa," Jack scoffed, stepping forward as if to challenge Ethan. "I don't need a lecture from some suit about respect." Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he gestured subtly, and one of the men behind him stepped forward, producing a tablet. With a few taps, the man turned the screen toward Jack, who frowned as he read. "What the hell is this?" Jack demanded, his voice faltering. "Your records," Ethan replied smoothly. "Every bar fight, unpaid fine, and warrant. You've been busy." Jack's face reddened as the other bikers leaned in to get a better look. The youngest of them muttered, "Wait, you didn't tell us about this." Malik let out a low chuckle. "Technology's a wonderful thing, isn't it?" Jack's bravado was crumbling fast, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. "You think you can scare us off with a bunch of files? We're not afraid of you." Ethan stepped closer, his tone dropping to a dangerous level. "This isn't about fear. It's about accountability. You think you can walk into this town, intimidate its people, and get away with it?" He leaned in slightly, his voice now a whisper. "You're wrong." The bikers shifted uncomfortably, their unity fracturing under the weight of Ethan's words. One of the cafe patrons, an older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, suddenly spoke up. "These bikers have been causing trouble for weeks. It's about time someone put them in their place." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from the other patrons. The bikers, who had thrived on fear and silence, were now facing a community ready to push back. Malik stood, his movements deliberate. You boys might have thought you were the biggest fish in this pond. But let me tell you something. There's always someone bigger, someone smarter. He gestured toward Ethan. And this here? This is my family. That makes your problems my problems. Jack's confidence was now barely holding on by a thread. He glanced toward the exit, calculating his chances of escape. Ethan caught the look and smirked. I wouldn't, Ethan said simply. You've already dug yourself a hole. Don't make it deeper. For a moment, the room was still, the tension reaching its peak. Then Jack, his face a mask of defiance, turned to his crew. We're leaving. Let's go. The bikers hesitated, looking to Jack for direction. But Ethan's team didn't move, their presence a silent reminder that leaving wasn't entirely on Jack's terms. You'll leave when I say so, Ethan said firmly. First, you're going to apologize to everyone here. And then, you're going to clean up the mess you made in this town. Every bit of it. Jack opened his mouth to argue, but stopped when he saw the steely resolve in Ethan's eyes. He turned to the cafe patrons and muttered, Sorry. Louder, Ethan commanded. Jack glared but complied. We're sorry, he said, his voice raised just enough to carry through the room. The patrons exchanged looks of satisfaction, a small but meaningful victory in the face of months of intimidation. As the bikers shuffled out under Ethan's watchful eye, Malik placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. You've got a good head on your shoulders, Ethan, but this isn't over yet. Ethan nodded. I know. They'll think twice before coming back. But if they do, Malik's gaze hardened. We'll be ready. The hum of the cafe returned to normal, though the air still buzzed with the adrenaline of what had just transpired. Malik sat back down, his body weary but his mind sharp. Ethan, meanwhile, was checking his tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. You've grown up, Ethan, Malik said, his voice a mix of pride and curiosity. Not just a kid with a computer anymore. Ethan smirked without looking up. Guess you could say I've learned a few things. But the real question is, what's this about? These guys didn't just pick you randomly, did they? Malik's eyes darkened as memories surged forward. His silence spoke volumes. Grandpa, Ethan prompted gently. What aren't you telling me? Malik exhaled slowly, his hand running over the wooden table surface. It's not just about me, son. It's about what I represent to men like them. These bikers, people like Jack, they see someone like me, an old black man living alone, and they think I'm weak. Easy pickings. Ethan frowned. But they didn't just stumble across you. They've been targeting you specifically. Why? Malik hesitated, his gaze fixed on a spot just beyond Ethan's shoulder. Finally, he leaned in, his voice low. Back in the day, when I came home from the war, this town wasn't so welcoming to men like me. I fought to carve out a place here, fought hard, and I made enemies. Some of those grudges never went away. Ethan's expression tightened. You're telling me this is some grudge from decades ago? Maybe, Malik replied. Or maybe it's just the latest breed of cowards who think they can rewrite history. Before Ethan could respond, a voice interrupted their conversation. Excuse me. Both men turned to see the older woman who had spoken up earlier. Her sharp eyes now softened as she addressed Malik. Mr. Johnson, she said, nodding respectfully, I just wanted to say thank you for standing up to them. For all of us. Malik offered a small smile. Didn't do it alone. My grandson here deserves the credit. The woman turned her gaze to Ethan and smiled. Then thank you, young man. But if you'll allow me to say, you've always had more fight in you than most, Mr. Johnson. Malik raised an eyebrow. You know me? The woman chuckled. Oh, everyone in this town knows you, even if they pretend not to. You've been a part of this place longer than some of us have been alive. And some of us still remember what you've done for this community. Ethan looked between the two, intrigued. What exactly did he do? The woman's smile widened. You never told him? Malik waved a hand dismissively. A story for another time. The woman nodded knowingly and left, her parting words lingering in the air. Be careful, Mr. Johnson. They don't forget, and they don't forgive. Ethan leaned back, his curiosity now fully piqued. Okay, now you have to tell me. Malik shook his head, though a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. Not tonight, son. Right now, We need to figure out what our next move is. Ethan's expression turned serious. You think they'll come back? Malik nodded. Oh, they'll be back. Men like Jack don't take orders lightly. And when they do come, they'll bring more trouble with them. Ethan tapped his tablet thoughtfully. Then we need to be ready. I'll dig into Jack's crew, see what kind of skeletons they've got hidden. Maybe we can make them think twice before they try anything else. Malik studied his grandson for a moment, pride shining in his eyes. You've got a good head on your shoulders, Ethan. But remember, this isn't just about brains. It's about heart. You can't fight men like Jack unless you've got both. Ethan nodded, his determination unwavering. Don't worry, Grandpa. We've got this. As they stood to leave the cafe, Malik paused at the door, his gaze sweeping over the familiar streets. This town had been his home for decades, but tonight it felt different, like the ghosts of the past were stirring. Whatever's coming, he murmured, more to himself than to Ethan. We'll face it together. The two of them stepped out into the night, their silhouettes fading into the shadows. But the fight was far from over. The quiet of the night was deceptive, as if the entire town held its breath. Malik and Ethan walked side by side through the dimly lit streets, their shadows stretching long and thin under the flickering streetlights. The air was heavy with unspoken tension, and Malik's instincts told him this was the calm before the storm. Grandpa, what are you thinking? Ethan asked, breaking the silence. I'm thinking about how to stay 2 steps ahead of those bikers, Malik replied, his voice low but firm. Jack won't let this slide. Men like him are predictable in one way. They always come back, and they always escalate. Ethan nodded, pulling out his tablet. Then it's time we escalate too. Let me run some checks. These guys have to leave a digital footprint somewhere. Malik stopped in his tracks and put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Son, you're good with that thing, but be careful. Poking into the wrong places can get you noticed, and we don't need more trouble than we already have. Ethan smirked. You're underestimating me, Grandpa. They won't even know I'm there. The older man gave a soft chuckle, but didn't argue further. They continued down the street until they reached Malik's modest house, a small, weathered structure that had withstood time and more than its fair share of challenges. Inside, the air was filled with the comforting scent of cedar wood and old leather. Malik sank into his favorite armchair, the creak of the springs almost a greeting. Ethan set up his tablet on the coffee table, his fingers already flying across the keyboard. I'll start with their club, Ethan said, his eyes scanning the screen. Most of these gangs have social media pages or forums where they brag about their rides and exploits. It's like they want to get caught. Malik nodded approvingly. Reckless pride. That'll be their downfall. As Ethan worked, Malik leaned back and closed his eyes, letting memories of his past bubble to the surface. The woman at the cafe had reminded him of something he'd long tried to bury, the battles he'd fought not just overseas but here at home. Back in the 1960s, when he'd returned from war, Malik had been one of the first black men to open a business in the town. It hadn't been easy. The locals hadn't welcomed him with open arms, and some had gone out of their way to drive him out. But Malik had stood his ground, refusing to let prejudice dictate his life. That fight had earned him enemies, powerful ones. And though the years had dulled their faces in his memory, the hatred they represented still lingered in corners of the town, passed down like an inheritance. Grandpa? Ethan's voice pulled him back to the present. Yes, son? I think I've got something, Ethan said, his tone cautious but excited. He turned the tablet toward Malik. The gang calls themselves the Iron Vultures. They've got a Facebook page and a private forum. But here's the kicker. Jack's name isn't just on the membership list. He's the leader. Malik's brow furrowed. Figures. What else? They're small time, Ethan continued. Mostly petty stuff. Harassment, vandalism, some minor thefts. But there's chatter on their forum about expanding their territory. It's like they're trying to make a name for themselves. By targeting me, Malik said grimly. Ethan nodded. It's a power play. If they can intimidate someone like you, a veteran, a respected member of the community, they'll think they've got the town under their thumb. Malik leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. Then we can't let them win. But this isn't just about me, Ethan. This is about standing up for what's right, For everyone who's ever been pushed around by bullies like them. Ethan's eyes sparkled with determination. So, what's the plan? We hit them where it hurts, Malik said, his voice steady and resolute. Their pride, their reputation. You keep digging, find out who their allies are, and if they've got any dirt that can be used against them. I'll make a few calls. Ethan raised an eyebrow. To who? Malik gave a sly smile. Let's just say I've got some old friends who don't take kindly to bullies, and they owe me a favor or two. As the two of them strategized late into the night, the wind outside began to pick up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the porch. It was as if the town itself was bracing for what was to come. But inside that small house, a storm of a different kind was brewing, one fueled by justice, resilience, and the unshakable bond between a grandfather and his grandson. Malik sat at the edge of his bed, the weight of the night pressing heavily on his shoulders. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic clicking of Ethan's keyboard in the living room. Malik glanced at his old flip phone sitting on the bedside table. Its worn exterior was a relic of simpler times, but tonight, it held the key to their next move. With a deep breath, Malik picked up the phone and began dialing a number he hadn't called in years. The sound of each button click echoed in the silence, stirring memories of camaraderie and battles fought shoulder to shoulder. The line rang twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered. Who's calling this late? It's Malik, he said, his tone steady but laced with urgency. There was a pause on the other end, then a warm laugh. Malik Washington, you old son of a gun. It's been what, 20 years? Closer to 30, Malik replied with a faint smile. How's retirement treating you, Earl? Quiet, peaceful. But something tells me you're not calling to reminisce about the good old days. You've always been sharp, Malik said. Listen, Earl, I need a favor. A big one. There was a shuffling sound as Earl likely shifted in his chair. Go on. Malik explained the situation. About Jack, the Iron Vultures, and their threats. As he spoke, his old friend listened in silence, occasionally grunting in acknowledgement. When Malik finished, there was a long pause. You're up against bikers? Earl finally said. Hell, Malik, at your age, I'd expect you to be gardening, not squaring off with gangs. I didn't go looking for trouble, Earl, Malik replied. But it found me, and I'm not backing down. I just need a little help, someone with connections and muscle who can send a message that these punks won't forget. Earl sighed. You always had a way of dragging me into your messes. All right, I've got some guys who might be interested in helping. But Malik, this could get ugly. You sure you're ready for that? I've been ready since 1965, Malik said firmly. Earl chuckled. All right, old man. I'll make some calls. You'll hear back from me by tomorrow. Thanks, Earl. I owe you. You owe me more than you can pay back, but we'll settle that later. Take care, Malik. The line went dead, and Malik exhaled deeply, setting the phone down. His hand trembled slightly, a reminder of both his age and the stakes they were up against. He stepped into the living room where Ethan was still working, his face illuminated by the bluish glow of the tablet. Any luck? Malik asked. Ethan grinned. Plenty. I found a few posts on their forum about a planned show of force tomorrow night. They're gearing up for something big, Grandpa? Malik nodded. Good. Let them come. We'll be ready. Ethan looked at him quizzically. You've got a plan? I've got allies, Malik said. Old ones, but reliable. They'll help us make a stand. Ethan's eyes widened. Wait, you mean like other veterans? Malik chuckled. Not just any veterans. These men know how to send a message without firing a shot. And they've got connections in places Jack and his crew wouldn't dare tread. Ethan leaned back, clearly impressed. Okay, now I'm intrigued. What can I do? Keep digging, Malik said. I want to know every move they're planning before they make it. And if you find anything illegal, we'll make sure the cops get a nice anonymous tip. Ethan gave a mock salute. Yes, sir. The night wore on, with Ethan combing through forums and Malik jotting down plans in a weathered notebook. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. But inside, the resolve was unshakable. Malik had spent his life fighting battles others thought he couldn't win, and this would be no different. By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, the stage was set. Malik wasn't just defending himself. He was defending his family, his dignity, and the principles he had stood for his entire life. The Iron Vultures were in for a surprise they wouldn't forget. The sun had barely risen, but Malik was already awake, his mind sharp and focused. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping on a cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on the empty space in front of him. His mind replayed the events of the past few days, the threats from the Iron Vultures, the calls for help, and the growing tension in the air. Ethan was still in his room, poring over his research, but Malik could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about dealing with a few punks. This was about sending a message, about reclaiming the respect that had been taken from him, and from others like him. The phone on the table buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. It was a text from Earl. "Got your guys lined up? They'll be at the meeting spot tonight. You better be ready." Malik didn't waste time with a response. He grabbed his jacket, buttoned it up, and made his way to the front door. His bones creaked as he moved, but there was no slowing him down now. He met Ethan in the living room, where the young man was scrolling through his tablet. "They're gearing up for something tonight," Ethan said, looking up at him. "I can feel it. I've got a few more details, but it looks like they've got backup coming in from out of town." "Figures," Malik muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. "They always bring in reinforcements when they start to feel the heat." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What's the plan now?" Malik's gaze hardened as he stood up straighter. "The plan is simple. We hold our ground. We send them a message loud and clear." Ethan seemed to hesitate for a moment, then nodded. "I'll be ready." Malik turned to the door, pausing for a moment before adding, "And keep an eye out. If anything feels off, we pull back. I don't want to take unnecessary risks." Ethan grinned. "I've got your back, Grandpa." "Good," Malik replied, his voice thick with determination. "Let's make sure they know who they're messing with." The old truck rumbled to life as Malik and Ethan drove toward the meeting spot, a secluded stretch of land just outside of town. The wind howled through the trees as the truck bounced along the uneven dirt road. Malik's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his mind running through the plans he and Earl had devised. When they arrived, the place was eerily quiet. No sign of the bikers yet, but Malik knew they were close. "You sure this is the spot?" Ethan asked, scanning the area. Malik nodded. "They won't expect us to meet them here. It's not their usual stomping ground. That'll work to our advantage." The sound of motorcycles grew louder in the distance, and Malik's heart rate quickened. This was it, the moment he had been preparing for. He glanced at Ethan, whose face was serious now, no longer the boy who had been playing around with tech and research. The bikers arrived in force, their engines roaring as they approached the clearing. Malik stood tall, his eyes scanning the group, noting the aggressive swagger of the gang members. But they didn't see what was coming. "Jack's not here yet," one of the bikers called out, eyeing Malik with disdain. "What's this old man doing here? You got a death wish or something?" Malik stood his ground, his voice calm but laced with authority. "You tell Jack that I'm here for him. He'll know who I am." A few of the bikers laughed, but Malik didn't flinch. He had faced down worse than these punks. He wasn't about to back down now. As if on cue, the sound of multiple vehicles echoed in the distance, cutting through the tension like a blade. Earl's team had arrived. The bikers' laughter faded as they realized they were no longer facing just Malik and Ethan. Several men emerged from the trees, armed with rifles and wearing tactical gear. Their eyes were cold and unwavering. "Malik?" one of the bikers asked, his tone now unsure. "Tell Jack this is just a preview of what happens when you mess with the wrong people," Malik said, his voice firm. The bikers took a step back, their bravado slipping away as they sized up the unexpected threat. They knew the odds were no longer in their favor. "You came to the wrong place, old man," the leader of the gang said, his voice tinged with anger. "We're not scared of you." Malik didn't respond. Instead, he signaled to Earl's men, who began to encircle the group, blocking any potential escape routes. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. One of the bikers, a tall, muscular man with tattoos covering his arms, took a step forward, cracking his knuckles. "This doesn't have to get ugly," he sneered. We'll leave and forget this ever happened. Just walk away, and we'll be done. Malik's eyes locked onto the man, his gaze unwavering. No, you won't. Because you're going to remember this night. All of you are. Ethan stood at his side, hands clenched, ready for whatever might come next. The standoff stretched on, each side waiting for the other to make the first move. Malik's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. He wasn't going to let these men intimidate him. Not now, not ever. The bikers had made their move, but now it was Malik's turn. The standoff dragged on, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Malik stood firm, every muscle in his body poised for action. His eyes remained fixed on the biker leader, who had not yet made a move, his hand twitching near the grip of a large knife on his belt. Ethan, standing beside him, glanced around, his hands subtly resting near the small tactical device he had hidden in his jacket. They were ready, but they were also waiting. Malik could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. It wasn't just about surviving the encounter. It was about making sure the bikers knew they were no longer in control. He had seen enough in his 93 years to know that sometimes the hardest part of a fight wasn't the physical blows. It was knowing when to strike, when to hold back, and when to force your adversary into a corner they couldn't escape from. "You don't want this, old man," the biker leader sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Malik didn't flinch. He had faced worse than this. "You don't know me, kid," Malik said coldly, his voice unwavering. "But you will, and you won't forget tonight." The bikers looked from one another, unsure of what to do. Their bravado was starting to crack. Malik could see it in their eyes. Doubt was creeping in. They didn't know what he had up his sleeve, but they were beginning to realize that this wasn't just another easy target. Ethan moved slightly, a subtle shift in his stance, signaling that he was ready. Malik could feel the heat of the moment rising. The bikers weren't going to just turn around and leave. Not without a fight. The leader of the gang, his face contorted in frustration, finally made the first move. He lunged toward Malik, drawing his knife with a speed that was almost too quick to react to. Malik's heart raced, but he was ready. He pivoted to the side just as the blade came slicing through the air, narrowly missing him. The wind from the knife's swish barely grazed Malik's cheek, but the danger was clear. The gang wasn't going to back down. They had crossed the line, and now it was time to respond. Malik's hands moved quickly, drawing the small pistol he kept concealed beneath his jacket, the weight familiar in his grip. He had no intention of killing anyone, but he would do what was necessary to protect himself and his grandson. The biker leader's eyes widened when he saw the gun, his bravado instantly vanishing. He stopped mid-lunge, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "You're not gonna shoot me, old man," he taunted. "You're too weak for that." But Malik didn't hesitate. The barrel of the gun remained steady, aimed at the leader's chest. He didn't need to speak. His stance, his eyes, said it all. "You think you're in control?" Malik's voice was low, dangerous. "I've fought in wars. I've faced down worse than you. You're nothing but a bully with a bike and a knife. But if you're looking for a fight, I'll be happy to give you one." The leader took a step back, his cocky smirk replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. His gaze flicked to the rest of the bikers, who were now eyeing the scene warily. They had expected an easy confrontation, a chance to humiliate the old man, but this wasn't what they had bargained for. Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about you anymore. This is about the way you've been treating people in this town. You want to keep pushing? You can, but be ready for the consequences." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. The numbers were on their side, but they knew they were no longer dealing with the frightened, frail old man they had assumed Malik to be. One of the bikers, a burly man with a heavily tattooed neck, took a step forward, his fists clenched. He looked ready to throw down, but the leader stopped him with a sharp gesture. "Hold up," the leader muttered, his eyes still locked on Malik. He glanced around at the encircling group of Earl's men, who were standing firm with rifles slung over their shoulders. The bikers were outnumbered, and they knew it. For a moment, the clearing was silent. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees filled the air, a quiet reminder of the stillness before a storm. Then the leader lowered his knife, muttering an expletive under his breath. "We're not done here," he spat, his eyes still filled with anger, but there was fear there now too. "This isn't over." Malik didn't flinch. "I'll be waiting." Without another word, the gang began to back off, one by one. The leader gave Malik one last glare, then turned, mounting his motorcycle. The rest of the bikers followed suit, slowly revving their engines as they made their way back into the woods. The threat wasn't gone, but Malik had sent a clear message. As the sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, Malik holstered his gun and turned to Ethan. "We did what we had to do," Malik said quietly, "but don't mistake that for victory. This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Ethan nodded. "I know, but at least we sent them a message." Malik turned to the rest of the group. "Get ready. It's only going to get worse from here." The battle was far from over, but Malik was more determined than ever to see it through. They had sent a warning, but there was much more to come. The quiet that followed the bikers' retreat was almost unnerving. The woods, which had been so tense only moments before, seemed eerily still. Malik stood with his hand resting on the gun at his side, watching the road leading into the distance. The sound of motorcycles had faded, but the uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach hadn't gone away. He knew this wasn't the end. The bikers had been humiliated, but their pride would push them to retaliate. He could feel it in the air. There was more to come. Ethan stood beside him, eyes scanning the surroundings. "We need to prepare. They won't let this go. They'll be back." Malik nodded, his face grim. He had lived through too many battles to know that a retreat didn't mean defeat. If anything, it only made the enemy more dangerous. "We'll be ready," Malik replied. "This time, we hit them first." Ethan looked at his grandfather with a mixture of admiration and concern. Malik was no longer the frail old man the bikers had thought him to be. His years of experience, of battle and survival, had sharpened his instincts, and he wasn't about to let anyone threaten his family or his land. "We need to get the others ready," Malik said, turning to the group that had gathered around the cabin. "We'll have to fortify this place. They'll come at us in full force next time." The group nodded. Earl, who had been standing a few feet away, stepped forward, his broad shoulders tense. "What do you need, Malik?" "We'll do whatever it takes to make sure they don't come back." Malik's mind raced as he considered their options. They were outnumbered, and the bikers had the element of surprise on their side, but Malik had lived through worse odds. He had fought battles that had seemed unwinnable, and he had walked away victorious. "We'll start by reinforcing the perimeter," Malik said. "I want lookout points on all four sides of this place. We'll need to know if they're coming before they get too close. Then, we'll set up traps, nothing too obvious, but enough to slow them down." Ethan, his face set in determination, stepped forward. "I'll handle the tech. I can rig some surveillance cameras around the perimeter, maybe even some motion sensors. That should give us a heads up if they try to sneak up on us." Malik smiled, proud of his grandson. Ethan's tech skills had proven invaluable, especially in a world that was becoming more and more dependent on technology for defense. "Good. We'll need every advantage we can get," Malik replied. He looked around at the small group of allies who had gathered around them. "We stand together. That's our strength. They can't take that from us." The group dispersed to start preparing, and Malik took a moment to stand alone on the porch of the cabin. The air was cool against his skin, a reminder that time was moving forward. But for him, it felt like the world had been stuck in place for years, waiting for a moment like this. In the distance, he heard the faint sound of a car approaching. Malik's hand instinctively moved to his side, where his gun rested. But it wasn't a motorcycle. It was a car, driving slowly up the gravel path toward the cabin. Malik squinted, trying to make out the shape of the vehicle as it grew closer. It was a black SUV, its windows tinted. A sleek, expensive car. He raised an eyebrow. This wasn't just any visitor. The car came to a stop in front of the cabin, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a sharp suit, and his presence seemed to command the air around him. His cold, calculating eyes scanned the area before settling on Malik. "You must be Malik Harris," the man said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge. "I've heard a lot about you." Malik's gaze didn't waver. "Who wants to know?" The man smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. Name's Charles Donovan. I represent interests that would like to see this situation resolved quietly. Malik's grip tightened around the railing of the porch. What kind of interests? Donovan's smile grew colder. The kind that don't take kindly to disruptions in their business. I'm here to offer you a deal. Malik narrowed his eyes. He didn't trust this man, not for a second. He had dealt with enough men like him in his life to know that they didn't offer deals out of kindness. What kind of deal? Malik asked, his voice low and steady. Donovan stepped forward, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. You let the bikers handle their business. You stay out of their way, and in return, we'll ensure no more trouble comes your way. No more intrusions on your property. You'll be left alone. Malik didn't respond immediately. He considered the offer, weighing his options. He could easily refuse. He had nothing to lose. But there was something about the way Donovan was speaking, something in his eyes, that made Malik suspicious. Why don't you tell your business interests to leave my land and my people alone? Malik said, his voice calm but resolute. Donovan's expression darkened, the smile disappearing. You don't understand the position you're in. I'm offering you a chance to walk away with your dignity intact. Malik didn't flinch. I don't need your pity, and I don't need your deal. If your business interests want to fight, they'll get one. But make no mistake, we'll fight for what's ours. And we won't back down. Donovan stared at him for a moment, as if weighing whether to push further. Finally, he turned on his heel, his face cold. This isn't over, Malik. You've made a mistake. The sound of the SUV's engine roared to life, and Donovan's car sped off down the gravel road, disappearing into the distance. Malik watched it go, his mind already racing with the possibilities. This wasn't a simple fight anymore. It was a war. The encounter with Charles Donovan lingered in Malik's mind like a heavy weight. The man had made his intentions clear. The bikers were just the beginning. If Malik and his people didn't bend, there would be consequences. Malik knew that walking away wasn't an option. Not now. Not ever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the woods in shades of orange and purple, Malik stood in the center of the cabin, addressing the group that had gathered. His son, Earl, stood beside him, his expression hard, his broad arms crossed in defiance. Ethan was at the back, fiddling with a tablet, setting up surveillance equipment. The others, neighbors, friends, and allies, watched Malik with a mixture of concern and resolve. They had all seen what Malik was capable of, but none of them had been in a fight like this before. We've got to be ready for whatever comes next, Malik said, his voice cutting through the air like steel. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about sending a message. We're not going to let anyone, no one, push us around. Earl nodded, his jaw tightening. We've got your back, Malik. We've been through worse. Malik turned to face his grandson, who had just finished installing a set of motion sensors around the perimeter of the cabin. Ethan's fingers flew over the screen of his tablet, his concentration unwavering. How's it looking, son? It's set up, Ethan said without looking up. I've got cameras covering every angle. Motion detectors in place. If they try anything, we'll know. Malik grinned. Good work. We need every edge we can get. As the group got to work fortifying the cabin and setting up their defenses, Malik's thoughts turned to Donovan's cryptic words. Who were these so-called business interests he represented? And what did they want with him? Damn right, we won't back down, Malik muttered under his breath. He had fought too many battles in his life to let some man in a suit push him around. By nightfall, the cabin had been reinforced. Sandbags had been piled around the perimeter, making it more defensible. Wooden planks reinforced the windows, and inside, a small stockpile of food, water, and supplies was ready. The traps were set, simple but effective. The next time the bikers, or anyone else, came, they wouldn't have the advantage. As Malik sat down to catch his breath, he felt the weight of his age more acutely than ever. His body was no longer the same, and while his mind was sharp, the years had taken their toll. But there was something in him, something unshakable, that wouldn't allow him to retreat. Not now. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, and he picked it up, expecting a call from Ethan or Earl. Instead, it was a message from an unknown number. Malik's fingers hesitated over the screen, but curiosity won out, and he opened it. "Malik, this is Donovan. I'll give you one more chance to accept my offer. You know what's coming next, and you won't be able to fight it. Take the deal. It's your only option. If you don't, there will be consequences. This is your final warning." Malik read the message several times, his thoughts swirling. He had expected more threats, but the directness of Donovan's ultimatum unsettled him. He set the phone down, his gaze fixed on the dimming light outside. This wasn't just about protecting his home anymore. It was about standing firm against a force that didn't care about right or wrong, about justice or loyalty. He stood up slowly, feeling the ache in his joints, but ignoring it. "Ethan," he called, his voice firm. His grandson appeared at his side almost instantly, his brow furrowed in concern. "What's up, Grandpa?" "We need to make sure we're ready," Malik said, his tone steady. "Donovan isn't done with us. We have to take the fight to him. We're not just defending ourselves anymore. We're making sure he knows not to mess with us again." Ethan looked at him, hesitation flickering in his eyes. "Are you sure, Grandpa? I mean, this could get really ugly." Malik nodded, his expression hardening. "I've been in uglier situations, son. This time, we make the rules, not them." Ethan swallowed hard, but he nodded. "All right, I'll get the rest of the equipment ready. We're all in this together." As the night wore on, the group continued to prepare. Malik didn't sleep. He couldn't. He could feel it in his bones. Something was coming, and he needed to be ready. He wasn't going to let anyone threaten his family or his land. The wind picked up, rustling the trees outside, and Malik couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The bikers were the tip of the iceberg, and if Donovan was involved, things were going to get a lot more complicated. But Malik was ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about standing tall and showing everyone that no matter how many times life knocked him down, he'd always rise again. And this time, he wasn't alone. The early morning light barely touched the horizon when Malik rose from his bed, the familiar ache of his body a constant reminder of his years. The cabin was still quiet, save for the rustling of trees outside and the soft hum of the surveillance system Ethan had set up the night before. Malik wasn't sure what he expected, but he knew one thing for certain: the calm wouldn't last. As he stood by the window, looking out at the trees swaying in the wind, his mind raced through every possibility. The bikers, Donovan's threats, the looming violence. It was all building toward something. The question was, what? Grandpa? Malik turned to find Ethan standing in the doorway, his face pale under the harsh light of the early morning. "You hear anything?" "Not yet," Malik said, his voice steady. "But we'll know soon enough. They're coming." Ethan nodded, looking over at the table where a map of the surrounding area lay open. "We've got all the cameras working, motion sensors in place. If they're anywhere nearby, we'll know." Malik smiled slightly, proud of his grandson. "Good. Stay sharp, son." Just then, the phone rang, its shrill tone breaking the stillness of the cabin. Malik's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't let it show. He picked up the receiver slowly, his fingers tight around the edge. "This is Malik." A cold laugh echoed from the other end of the line. "Didn't expect you to answer, old man," the voice on the other end sneered. "You've got guts, I'll give you that." Malik didn't flinch. "I don't know who you are, but I'm done playing games." The voice dropped lower, more sinister. "You'll find out soon enough. This is just the beginning. We're coming for you, Malik. All of us. And when we're done, there won't be anything left of you but memories." The line went dead. Malik set the phone down carefully, his expression unchanged. Ethan had heard the conversation and was already moving, grabbing his gear. "Grandpa, they're coming. We need to get ready." Malik turned to face him, his jaw tight. "They can come, but they'll regret it. We're not backing down." The next few hours felt like an eternity. The tension in the cabin thickened as everyone prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Earl and the others double-checked the defensive positions, making sure that every door and window was reinforced. Ethan ran diagnostics on the surveillance equipment, watching the screens for any sign of movement in the surrounding woods. But nothing. It was too quiet. The calm before the storm. Malik paced, his mind working in overdrive. Donovan's words echoed in his head. We're coming for you. He knew the bikers weren't the only threat. There were others out there, people with power and resources who could turn the tide in an instant. The thought of what they could do to his family made his blood boil, but he kept his emotions in check. Panic would do them no good now. They needed a plan. As the afternoon dragged on, the tension grew unbearable. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind seemed to bring Malik's mind racing back to the worst-case scenario. But just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, a voice broke through the quiet. "Grandpa," Ethan said, his voice low and urgent, "there's movement. I'm seeing bikes coming down the road." Malik's heart stilled. This was it. The bikers were here. The cabin went silent as everyone took their positions, guns in hand, eyes glued to the surveillance screens. Malik could hear the hum of engines in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. The bikers were getting closer, and with them, the storm that Malik had been preparing for. "Stay calm," Malik instructed, his voice low but commanding. "They're looking for a fight. We're not giving them one. We're going to make sure they don't get past that gate." Ethan glanced at him. What if they don't stop there? Malik met his grandson's gaze, his face hardening. "Then we make them." The motorcycles roared into view, their engines deafening as they approached the cabin. At least a dozen of them, dressed in black leather jackets, their faces hidden behind helmets, rode like an ominous wave crashing toward the shore. Malik's blood ran cold as he recognized the leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down the side of his face. It was the same man who had led the bikers in the first confrontation, the one who had taunted Malik. "Get ready," Malik said quietly, his hand on the shotgun by his side. The bikes slowed as they neared the gate, their riders dismounting with a mixture of casual arrogance and quiet menace. They had come to intimidate, and Malik wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The leader of the gang took off his helmet, revealing a cruel grin. "Malik," he called, his voice carrying in the still air. "You think you can hide out here forever? We're just getting started." Malik stepped forward, his voice steady and cold. "You can't intimidate me, and you sure as hell can't run me off my own land." The leader's grin faltered for a moment, but then he chuckled. "You're going to regret that. The boss doesn't like being crossed." Malik stood tall, unwavering. "Tell your boss that I'll be ready. And if he thinks he can break me, he's got another thing coming." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Malik could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They weren't used to being challenged like this. Without another word, the leader signaled for his men to mount their bikes. "This isn't over, Malik," he said, his voice a low growl. "You'll regret this." The engines roared to life again, and the gang of bikers sped off, their tires kicking up dirt as they disappeared down the road. Malik didn't move, watching them go. He knew this was just the beginning. They would be back, and next time, they wouldn't be alone. The night was still, but the silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. Malik stood on the porch of the cabin, staring out into the darkness, his hand resting on the worn handle of his shotgun. He knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The bikers would regroup, and when they returned, they'd come with a vengeance. Ethan stood beside him, his face tight with worry. "Grandpa, what happens next?" Malik turned to him, meeting his eyes with a strength that belied his age. "Next, we get ready. We won't let them break us. We'll make sure they know they can't just waltz in here and take what's ours." Ethan nodded, but Malik could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. He understood. The weight of what they were facing was a burden, one that no one, especially not a young man like Ethan, should have to bear. But it was too late to turn back now. The door behind them creaked open, and Earl stepped out onto the porch. "Everything's locked down. I've been around the perimeter. Nothing unusual." "Good," Malik said, his voice gruff. "But I don't trust them. I don't trust anything about this situation." Earl looked over at him, his face serious. "They'll come back, but we're ready. We've got the right people here. We'll defend this place, no matter what." The resolve in Earl's voice was comforting, but Malik couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something. There was a bigger game at play here, something more dangerous than just a few bikers looking to stir trouble. The next morning, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Malik spent the day double-checking everything. The surveillance, the gate, the firearms. Every movement outside seemed like a threat. Every rustle in the trees made his heart race. Ethan had been glued to the screens, tracking the bikers' movements, but there was nothing, just silence. At dusk, Malik made a call. It was time to bring in someone who could level the playing field. He hadn't wanted to involve anyone else, but the situation was spiraling out of control. The biker gang was just the tip of the iceberg, and Malik knew if they were going to survive this, they needed help, someone with the resources to push back. Ethan looked over at him, concern written all over his face. "Who are you calling?" Malik didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up the phone, dialing a number from memory. It rang twice before the familiar voice on the other end answered. "Malik? It's been a long time," the voice said, thick with an accent Malik recognized instantly. "What's going on?" "I need help," Malik said, his voice low. "There's a gang of bikers harassing me, but it's not just them. I've got a feeling this is bigger than that. I need someone who knows how to handle this kind of thing." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then the voice spoke again, firm and steady. "I can help, Malik. I've got some people who owe me favors. I'll send them your way. They'll be there by nightfall." "Good. Make sure they're ready for anything," Malik said, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't know how far this goes, but I'll be damned if I'm going to let them take this place from me." After the call ended, Malik turned to Ethan and Earl. "Help's on the way, but we can't wait for them to make their move. We need to be ready to fight back now." Ethan looked uneasy but nodded. "We're ready. We've got this." Malik gave him a rare smile, proud of his grandson's courage. "We've got each other. That's all we need." The rest of the day passed slowly, the anticipation mounting with each passing hour. The sun dipped below the horizon, and Malik couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. It was just a matter of when. As night fell, the silence was shattered by the sound of tires crunching over gravel. Malik's eyes narrowed, his senses going on high alert. He stepped out onto the porch, his hand still on the shotgun, his heart racing. "Grandpa, they're back," Ethan whispered, his eyes wide. The headlights of several vehicles pierced the darkness, illuminating the area around the cabin. But it wasn't just the bikers. This time, there were others too. Figures in dark clothing, their faces hidden under hoods and masks, moving like shadows across the yard. Malik felt the weight of the moment settle over him. This was it. The storm was here. The bikers revved their engines, circling the cabin like predators, but the strangers in the masks didn't say a word. They just stood there, their presence menacing, their eyes cold and unwavering. Malik didn't flinch. He stepped forward, holding his ground. "You've got one chance to leave. Turn around and walk away. This isn't your fight." The biker leader sneered, stepping forward. "We're done talking. You're out of time, old man." Malik's finger tightened on the trigger of the shotgun, but just before he could take action, the sound of approaching vehicles cut through the tension. Black SUVs, their engines loud and commanding, rolled up to the edge of the property, blocking the bikers' path. The figures in the masks stepped back, their attention momentarily diverted. The SUV's doors opened, and men in tactical gear emerged, their movements swift and purposeful. Malik's heart raced. It was happening. The cavalry had arrived. The leader of the bikers looked around, his bravado faltering as the men in black surrounded them. "Who the hell are these guys?" Malik smiled grimly. "You're about to find out." The bikers' leader, a burly man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms, scowled as the men in tactical gear surrounded him and his gang. The hum of engines from the black SUVs reverberated through the air, adding to the tension that gripped the night. Malik's heart raced, but his grip on the shotgun tightened. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the turning point. "Who the hell are these guys?" the biker snarled, his voice laced with anger. The leader of the tactical team, a tall man with sharp eyes, stepped forward and addressed the gang with calm authority. "We're here to ensure this situation doesn't escalate any further. You're outmatched, so it's time to leave. Now." The biker scoffed, clearly unwilling to back down. "I don't take orders from anybody. Not from you, not from him," he pointed a finger at Malik, "and not from anyone who thinks they can stop me." The tension was palpable. Malik could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He'd never wanted violence, but he wasn't going to let anyone destroy what he'd fought for. He'd been pushed to the brink, and now he was ready to take back control. "You don't understand, do you?" Malik said, his voice steady, though the anger simmered beneath the surface. "This isn't about intimidation. This is about respect, and you've lost mine." The biker leader let out a guttural laugh. "Respect? You're just some old man hiding behind these guys. You think they'll protect you?" Before anyone could react, the sound of the wind shifting, a vehicle door opening, and a low murmur from the tactical team's leader signaled the beginning of the end. Malik's phone buzzed, breaking the tension momentarily. He glanced at it. A message from his contact. The backup was here. The biker leader turned to the men in black, but his defiance was waning. His gang was looking around nervously, unsure of how to respond to the growing pressure. Malik could see the fear creeping into their eyes. "You've got one chance," Malik said, his voice cold and commanding. "Walk away. Disband. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Or face the consequences." A beat of silence followed, then another, as the bikers exchanged glances. Malik held his breath. If they attacked now, it would be chaos. The tactical team was prepared, but the bikers had numbers and weapons, and it wouldn't be easy. Finally, the leader of the bikers spat on the ground and took a step back, motioning for his crew to follow. "This ain't over, old man. You've made a mistake." Malik didn't flinch. He knew the bikers weren't finished yet, but this was a victory, for now. He nodded to the tactical team leader, who motioned for his men to lower their weapons, but the silence held an undeniable weight. The bikers backed off, retreating slowly toward their motorcycles. As they mounted their bikes and revved their engines, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The leader of the bikers shot one last look at Malik before gunning his engine and speeding off, his gang following close behind. Malik exhaled slowly, his hands still gripping the shotgun. The immediate danger had passed, but something told him this wasn't the end. The bikers would regroup. They would plan their next move. And next time, they wouldn't be alone. The tactical team leader approached Malik, offering a firm handshake. "We'll keep an eye on them. You made the right call." Malik nodded, but his mind was already working, piecing together the larger puzzle. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot. There's more going on here than just a few bikers causing trouble." Ethan stepped up beside his grandfather, his face a mix of relief and wariness. "What do we do now?" "We prepare," Malik replied. "This might be quiet for a little while, but when it's over, we'll be ready. And when they come back, we'll make sure they know they made a big mistake." The tactical team began to disperse, but Malik's mind raced. His contact had promised backup, but he needed to dig deeper into what was driving the bikers' aggression. Someone had to be pulling the strings behind the scenes, and Malik was determined to find out who. The night stretched on in a tense quiet, and as the cabin grew still, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that they were in the calm before a much bigger storm. He had no illusions about what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't go down without a fight. And this time, he wasn't alone. The air had cooled, but the tension lingered like a heavy fog. Malik leaned against the porch of his cabin, the dim glow of the distant streetlights casting long shadows across the yard. His heart had slowed, but his mind was in overdrive. The bikers had left, but their retreat was only temporary. He knew it. Ethan stood beside him, his gaze flicking nervously to the road, as if expecting the roar of motorcycle engines to break the silence at any moment. Malik glanced down at his grandson, the worry in his eyes clear. Ethan wasn't just worried about the bikers. He was worried about Malik. "Grandpa, what happens if they come back? What if they bring more people next time?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with fear. Malik took a deep breath. "Then we handle it, like we just did. But next time, we'll be ready." "Are we really ready, though?" Ethan pressed. "I mean, what if we're not?" Malik turned his gaze toward the woods behind them, as though searching for the answers in the shadows. He wasn't just talking about the bikers. There was something bigger going on here. The fact that these thugs had targeted him, an 81-year-old veteran, wasn't random. This was personal. But to whom? I've been fighting battles my whole life, son, Malik said, his voice steady. Some of them were bigger than this, but I've never backed down, and I'm not about to start now. Ethan nodded, but Malik could see the hesitation in his eyes. The world had changed. The threats were different, and they were facing something Malik had never experienced before. An enemy that wasn't just physical but something deeper, darker. He couldn't ignore the feeling that something more was at play here, something beyond the bikers' intimidation tactics. We'll need more information, Malik muttered to himself, his fingers tapping against the shotgun. The bikers had been aggressive, but he wasn't convinced that they were the masterminds behind the attacks. It didn't add up. They were just the muscle. But who was pulling the strings? Ethan stepped closer, his voice lower now. Grandpa, what if you're right? What if there's someone behind all of this? Malik glanced at him, seeing the worry in his grandson's eyes. Ethan wasn't just afraid of the bikers. He was afraid of what they represented. The larger system that allowed people like these bikers to thrive with impunity. We find out who's behind it, Malik said, his voice hardening, and we stop them before they hurt anyone else. But as Malik said the words, he knew how dangerous that path could be. He had no illusions about what might be coming. The bikers weren't just a gang. They were a symptom of something bigger, a culture of intimidation and fear that ran deep. And this time, it wasn't just his life at stake. It was the future of everyone he cared about. I need to make some calls, Malik muttered, turning away from the porch. I need to find out who else is involved in this. I've got a feeling this isn't going to be over anytime soon. Ethan followed him inside, his face a mix of determination and concern. What's the plan, Grandpa? Malik grabbed his phone, his fingers moving quickly as he dialed the number he'd been holding in reserve. He needed answers, and the only way to get them was to go deeper into the network of people who might know something about the bikers' connections. If there was a bigger player involved, he was going to find them. The phone rang 3 times before the voice on the other end picked up. Malik, the voice said, a gravelly tone on the other end. I was wondering when you'd call. You in trouble? Malik smirked. You could say that. I need information. Something bigger's going on, and I think the bikers are just the tip of the iceberg. There was a long pause before the voice responded. I'll need a little time. But if I'm right, you're dealing with more than just a local gang. There are people in high places who don't like it when their business gets disturbed. You might want to be careful. Malik's heart skipped a beat. High places? What are you talking about? You'll find out soon enough, the voice replied. But make no mistake, this is just the beginning. You've stirred up something that's not going to go away. And it's not just about you anymore. The line went dead before Malik could respond. He stood there, staring at the phone for a moment, before slowly lowering it. The weight of the conversation hung heavy in the room. Grandpa? Ethan asked, his voice tinged with concern. What did they say? Malik turned to face his grandson. We're not just fighting bikers, Ethan. We're fighting a system. And if we don't get ahead of it, things are going to get a lot worse. Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes wide with fear. But Malik saw the same fire in his eyes that he had when he was younger. The fire that refused to back down, no matter how big the fight was. We'll be ready, Ethan said, his voice firm. Malik nodded. We have to be. The door to the cabin slammed open suddenly, and a man in a black suit stepped inside, his face obscured by a pair of dark sunglasses. Malik's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a random visit. I've been sent by a friend, the man said, his voice cold. We need to talk. Malik's mind raced. Whoever this man was, he had come at just the right moment. And whatever information he had, it could change everything. The man in the dark suit stepped inside the cabin without waiting for an invitation. His movements were sharp and deliberate, and despite the heat of the moment, there was an eerie calm about him. His eyes were hidden behind the dark lenses, but Malik could feel the weight of his presence. Whoever this was, he wasn't just any stranger. And the fact that he knew where Malik lived meant he was deeply involved in what was happening. Ethan stood by Malik's side, his eyes wide and filled with caution. This was new territory, and neither of them knew what this man's intentions were. You don't know me, the man said, breaking the silence. But I know you. You're Malik Harris, the vet who served in the 82nd Airborne. The one who doesn't take shit from anyone, no matter how tough they are. Malik's chest tightened. He wasn't surprised that someone had been looking into him. In his line of work, both in and out of the military, he had made more than his share of enemies. What surprised him was that this man knew so much. "And what do you want?" Malik's voice was steady, but his mind was working overtime, weighing the options. He wasn't about to trust this stranger without knowing who he really was or what he was here for. The man's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Let's just say I've been watching the bikers, and I'm very familiar with the people behind them." Malik stiffened. He had known that the bikers weren't just a random nuisance, but to hear that someone was watching them and had knowledge of their connections to bigger powers made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "What's your angle?" Malik asked, his voice flat. The man in the suit took a step closer, his demeanor calm and unshaken. "I'm offering you an alliance, Mr. Harris. You've stirred up the hornet's nest, and now you're going to need help. The people you're up against have resources, connections that you can't even imagine. But I can give you access to the tools and the people who can make them pay." Malik raised an eyebrow. "You think you can buy me with threats and promises of power?" The man shook his head, his smile disappearing. "It's not a threat, Mr. Harris. It's a warning. The people you're dealing with aren't just bikers. They're a part of a much bigger operation. And if you don't get smart about this, they'll crush you before you even know what hit you." Ethan stepped forward, his youthful defiance shining through. "You think you can intimidate my grandpa? He's been through worse than this. He doesn't need your help." The man glanced at Ethan for a moment before turning his attention back to Malik. "This isn't just about you, son. You and your grandfather are already in over your heads. If you want to survive this, you're going to need more than guts. You're going to need power, influence, and a little bit of protection." Malik felt a surge of anger, but he tamped it down. He wasn't going to let this man control the situation. "You're not offering me protection. You're offering me a leash. And I don't wear leashes." The man's expression remained impassive. "Then you'll fight alone. But I promise you, it won't be long before you wish you hadn't turned down this offer. The bikers are just a small piece of this puzzle, Mr. Harris. And when you find out who's really pulling the strings, you'll regret not having someone on your side." The weight of his words hung in the air, thick with the promise of danger. Malik could feel the heat rising in the room. This was no longer just a fight for survival. This was a fight against something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. Ethan stood tall beside Malik, his voice unwavering. "We don't need you. We'll fight this on our own." The man's eyes flickered for a moment, as if considering Ethan's words. But then he nodded slowly. "Very well. But mark my words, Mr. Harris. You'll come to me when you realize what you're up against. And when that time comes, I'll be waiting." With that, the man turned and walked out of the cabin, his footsteps fading into the night. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Malik and Ethan standing in the quiet, the weight of his words pressing on their shoulders. Malik took a deep breath, the taste of uncertainty lingering in his mouth. Ethan looked at him, waiting for a response. "You think he's telling the truth?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Malik didn't answer immediately. He was still processing everything the man had said, and part of him didn't want to believe it. The thought of being caught in a web of corruption and power beyond his control made his stomach churn. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just a random fight with some bikers. It was something bigger, and it was about to get even more dangerous. "I don't trust him," Malik finally said, his voice steady. "But he's right about one thing. We're up against something bigger than we thought. And if we're going to win, we need to be smart." Ethan nodded, his expression hardening. "So what's the plan?" Malik's mind was already turning, formulating a strategy. He had fought in wars, survived impossible odds, and never once backed down from a fight. But this wasn't a war he could fight with sheer force. This was a war of intelligence, of connections, and of strategy. He had to outsmart them. But to do that, he needed to find out who was pulling the strings. "We get smart," Malik said. "We start gathering information, and we find out who's behind all this. Then, we take them down." Ethan met his gaze, his eyes burning with resolve. "I'm with you, Grandpa. All the way." Malik smiled faintly. I know you are, son, and we'll make sure no one hurts this family. As the night stretched on, the darkness outside seemed to grow heavier, but Malik felt something stirring within him. The battle had just begun, and though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was for sure. He wasn't going down without a fight. Malik sat in the dim light of his cabin, his thoughts a whirl of calculations. He had lived through wars, hostile forces, and moments of terror. But this felt different. The shadows were deeper this time, the enemy hidden behind layers of power and influence that Malik didn't fully understand yet. But he would. Ethan was pacing in the background, his nerves fraying. Malik could see the tension in his grandson's shoulders, the quiet worry in his eyes. The boy wasn't accustomed to this kind of uncertainty, but Malik had no intention of letting him get swept up in it. Not now, not ever. You're quiet, Ethan finally spoke, breaking the silence that had settled over them like a thick fog. Malik exhaled slowly, leaning forward in his chair, his fingers tapping against the edge of the table. I'm thinking, we need to find out more about these bikers, the ones who've been harassing us. They're just the surface. There's something bigger going on, something we haven't seen yet. You think that guy was telling the truth? About bigger powers behind them? Ethan asked, his voice laced with doubt. Malik didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood and walked toward the window, peering out into the night. The quiet was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind or the distant sound of an animal moving through the brush. But Malik knew this calm wouldn't last long. The storm was coming, and it was only a matter of time before the world they knew would shift in a way they couldn't control. I don't know, Malik said finally, his voice low, but I'm not taking any chances. We need to learn everything we can about who's involved with these bikers. We're going to find their connections. Ethan stopped pacing and met his grandfather's gaze. How do you plan to do that? You said it yourself. This goes beyond just a couple of thugs. These guys are connected, and we have no idea who they really answer to. Malik thought about the man who had visited them earlier, the one in the suit. The warning he'd given them echoed in Malik's mind. You'll come to me when you realize what you're up against. Malik had no intention of going crawling to that man for help, but he knew he couldn't take on this fight alone. Not now. We'll start small, Malik said, his eyes narrowing with determination. We track the bikers, see where they're getting their supplies, who they're meeting with, and then we dig deeper. There's always a paper trail, money, weapons, vehicles. We find it, and we follow it. Ethan nodded, his expression sharpening. You've got a plan. Malik smiled grimly. I always have a plan. The next few days were a blur of action. Malik's military instincts took over, sharpening his focus and pushing him to work harder than he had in years. He spent hours sifting through old military contacts, pulling in favors, and gathering as much intel as he could on the bikers. Ethan did his part, researching online and reaching out to anyone he could find who might have knowledge of the gang's operations. The bikers, Malik learned, were just one small piece of a much larger criminal network that stretched across state lines. They were involved in everything from illegal drug trafficking to organized robbery, and their ties to the underworld were deeper than anyone could have imagined. But what truly sent a shiver down Malik's spine was the mention of a shadowy figure known only as the broker. This person had connections with the bikers, and Malik suspected they were somehow behind the harassment. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that the broker wasn't just a name. This was someone with influence, someone who could turn the tide of a war without ever showing their face. Malik had to find them. He had to understand what they were after and why they'd set their sights on him. But there was no easy way to track down a ghost. As the days passed, Malik began to feel the weight of the fight settling on his shoulders. The tension was unbearable, and he knew it was only a matter of time before things escalated. But he couldn't afford to back down now. The stakes were too high. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a knock on the door startled both Malik and Ethan. Malik's hand instinctively went to the gun he kept holstered at his side, but he hesitated before opening the door. This was different. He wasn't expecting anyone. When the door creaked open, it revealed an older man with a weathered face and a serious expression. He was dressed in a plain brown jacket, and though he looked harmless enough, Malik could tell there was something about him that didn't quite sit right. "Mr. Harris?" the man asked, his voice raspy. Malik's instincts flared. He didn't recognize the man, but the tone of his voice suggested he wasn't just a stranger. "I'm Malik. What can I do for you?" Malik's voice was sharp, sizing up the man with every word. The man glanced over his shoulder, checking for anyone watching, before stepping closer. "I've got information on the bikers you've been dealing with," he said quietly, "and I think it's time we talk." Malik's heart skipped a beat. Was this a trap? Or was this the break he'd been waiting for? Before he could say anything, the man handed him a folded piece of paper and turned to leave without another word. Malik's mind raced. He opened the paper carefully, and as his eyes scanned the contents, his pulse quickened. It was a list of names, the bikers' leaders, and in the middle of it, there was a name that stood out like a sore thumb. The broker. It was time to make his move. Malik stood frozen in the doorway, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The name, the broker, was scrawled across the top of the list, surrounded by a network of contacts that spread like a web. It was clear that Malik was dealing with something much bigger than a bunch of rowdy bikers. This was a full-scale operation, one that had roots deep within the criminal underworld. Ethan, who had been standing behind him, peeked over his shoulder to see the list. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the names. "This is big, Grandpa. Whoever this broker is, they're untouchable. You can tell just by looking at how many people they have working for them." Malik didn't answer right away. His mind was already spinning, piecing together the fragmented puzzle. The bikers were the muscle, the enforcers, but this broker was the puppet master, pulling the strings from the shadows. Someone who remained out of sight, but whose influence stretched across cities, states, maybe even beyond. But Malik wasn't afraid of shadows. He'd fought in battles where the odds were impossible, where enemies were invisible, and survival was a game of wits. This was no different. He folded the paper carefully, slipping it into his jacket pocket. "We need to find out who this person is. No more playing around. These people are dangerous, but so am I." Ethan shifted his weight nervously, glancing toward the dimly lit driveway. "You sure we're ready for this? If we're going after someone like this, we're not just dealing with bikers anymore. We're talking about powerful people. People who can make us disappear without leaving a trace." Malik turned to face his grandson, the fire of determination in his eyes. "There's always a way. We'll start with the names on that list, track down who's behind the curtain. But you're right, Ethan. It won't be easy. We'll need help." Ethan's expression softened. "Who are you calling?" Malik didn't hesitate. "We've got some old friends in the business. People who owe me a favor or two. And I've got an idea where to start." The next day, Malik found himself in a small, discreet diner on the outskirts of town. It was a place he hadn't visited in years, back when he was still active, before the quiet life he had now. The grease-stained tables, the smell of coffee and burnt toast, everything felt the same as it always had. But the air was different today. Ethan sat across from him, tapping his fingers impatiently on the table. Malik could see the anxiety bubbling up in his grandson, but Malik didn't let it affect him. He was used to tension. He thrived in it. The door opened with a creak, and a tall man in a dark coat walked in, his presence commanding attention despite his unassuming appearance. He was middle-aged, with sharp eyes and a clean-shaven face, but there was something about him that screamed danger. Malik had known him back in the day. John "Slick" Matthews, a former informant who had helped him out of a tight spot more times than he could count. Slick slid into the seat next to Malik without a word, his eyes scanning the diner for any signs of danger. He nodded to Ethan, but his attention quickly returned to Malik. "You wanted to talk. I'm here. What's going on?" Malik leaned in, lowering his voice. "I need information. You know a guy by the name of the broker? Someone who's running a network behind a bunch of bikers in this town." Slick's eyes flickered with something between recognition and wariness. He paused for a moment before answering, his voice low and controlled. "I've heard of him. Hell, everyone has. The broker's a ghost. Doesn't leave a trail. Doesn't make a sound. He's untouchable. And the people who work for him? They're the kind of people you don't want to cross." "Tell me everything you know," Malik said, his tone firm. I'm not asking for favors, Slick. I need facts. Slick sighed and leaned back, rubbing his temples as if trying to gather his thoughts. I don't know much, but what I do know is this. The broker's been working behind the scenes for years. He runs the show from the shadows. No one's ever seen his face. But you can bet he's connected to people in high places. Cops, politicians, businessmen, you name it. He's got his hands in everything. And those bikers? They're just one of his assets. He uses them to muscle in on any territory that's worth something. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room. So, what? We're supposed to go after some anonymous ghost who runs everything from behind the scenes? Malik leaned forward, his voice steady and deliberate. We don't need to go after him. We just need to find him. And once we do, it's over. Slick chuckled dryly. If it were that easy, someone would have done it already. The broker doesn't leave a trail. He covers his tracks better than anyone I know. But if you're serious about this, I'll help you. Just don't expect it to be quick. And don't expect it to be clean. Malik's eyes were steely. I've been in worse situations, Slick. This isn't my first rodeo. You get me the information, and we'll take it from there. Slick nodded, a slight smirk tugging at his lips. All right, I'll see what I can do. But this is bigger than you think. You're stepping into something that could ruin you. Malik stood up, placing a few bills on the table. I've already been ruined. Now I'm fighting to fix it. As Malik and Ethan left the diner, the weight of the mission ahead pressed heavily on them. The pieces were falling into place, but the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it would become. There was no turning back now. They were in too deep, and Malik had no intention of backing down. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city streets. Malik and Ethan sat in the parked car, eyes scanning the empty parking lot of a rundown warehouse at the edge of town. The dim light flickered from a single street lamp, casting an eerie glow on the abandoned buildings that loomed like silent sentinels. Are you sure this is the place? Ethan asked, his voice laced with skepticism. He'd been quiet most of the ride, and Malik could tell he was getting anxious. They had been chasing dead ends for hours, and the thought of confronting someone like the broker had both of them on edge. Malik didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the crumpled list of names that had been passed to him. He had learned that every name on that list, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, had a link to the broker. The connections were there, deep, hidden, but they were there. And now, after following the trail through back alleys and dealing with hushed contacts, it all pointed to this warehouse. Trust me, Ethan, this is where we start pulling the strings. The broker's web isn't as untouchable as it seems, Malik said, his tone calm but firm. But we need to be smart. One wrong move, and this could blow up in our faces. Ethan didn't respond, but Malik could feel the tension in the air. He looked over at his grandson, who was staring out the window, his hand tightly gripping the door handle. They were in this together, and there was no turning back. Malik's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He checked the screen. An encrypted message from Slick. I got a name, Marcus Trent. He's a middleman for the broker. If you're looking for answers, he's the one to talk to. He's been spotted at the warehouse. Be careful. This guy doesn't play by the rules. Malik read the message and nodded to himself. It was the break they needed. Marcus Trent, the name hadn't come up in the search before, but now that it had, it would be the key to unraveling the rest of the broker's operation. Get ready, Ethan, Malik said, his voice taking on a serious edge. We're going in. Ethan nodded, his face set with determination. He was young, but Malik had trained him well. He could handle this. They both could. The warehouse was silent as they approached. The heavy door cracked open just enough to slip inside unnoticed. They moved quickly, their steps muffled by the worn floorboards beneath them. Malik's instincts were on high alert. He'd been in situations like this before, walking into places where the air was thick with tension, where every corner could hide an enemy. But this felt different. It wasn't just about fighting back or protecting themselves. It was about gathering the evidence to take down an entire network of criminals. As they moved deeper into the building, a faint noise reached Malik's ears, voices, low and indistinct, coming from a room ahead. He held up a hand to signal Ethan to stop, then slowly crept forward, staying out of sight. The voices grew louder as they neared. "Where the hell is Trent?" a man's voice growled. "He was supposed to meet us an hour ago." "Relax," another voice replied. "He's always late. But he'll come. He always does." Malik's pulse quickened. This was it. The middleman, Marcus Trent, was close. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. He signaled to Ethan, who nodded. Together, they positioned themselves at the door, ready to make their move. Malik took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. They burst through the door. The room was dimly lit, a few flickering overhead lights casting a sickly glow over a group of men sitting around a table. They looked up in surprise as Malik and Ethan entered. One of the men reached for a gun, but Malik was faster. He was already on him, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back before the gun could even clear his holster. Ethan moved swiftly to disarm another man who was trying to make a run for it. "Stay down," Malik growled, his grip tightening. "We're not here to play games." The room fell into an uneasy silence as Malik's sharp eyes scanned the remaining men. "Where is Marcus Trent?" A tall man with a scruffy beard, the one who had spoken earlier, stood up slowly, his hands raised. "He's not here. You came for the wrong guy." Malik didn't believe him, not for a second. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving the man's face. "You're lying. I'm not leaving until I get answers." The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the others in the room. "I don't know where he is," he said, his voice shaking now. "But I know who you're after. The broker. You're wasting your time. You'll never get him." Malik leaned in, his voice a low threat. "You're going to tell me everything you know about the broker, or I'll make you regret it." The man's defiance crumbled, and he broke eye contact. Slowly, he nodded toward the far corner of the room, where a door led into a back office. "Trent's office. He left a while ago, but you'll find what you're looking for in there." Without a word, Malik turned toward the door. He didn't need to say anything more. Ethan was already moving behind him, his focus on the task ahead. The office was small but cluttered, filled with papers, old files, and what looked like a safe tucked into the back wall. Malik moved quickly, rifling through the papers, looking for anything that might connect the dots. Ethan scanned the room as Malik pulled out a folder with a list of names, along with maps and photos that seemed to detail a much larger operation than they had anticipated. Then, Malik's eyes landed on something that made his blood run cold. A black and white photograph of a man standing next to the broker. It was a blurry image, but the face was unmistakable. "Gotcha," Malik muttered under his breath. He didn't need to look further. They had the lead they needed. As they turned to leave, the sound of a phone ringing echoed through the room. Malik's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he grabbed the phone off the desk. "Malik Harris," he said, his voice calm, controlled. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, a low, menacing voice spoke. "Did you really think you could find me? You've only just started to scratch the surface." Malik's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't flinch. "You can hide behind your shadows all you want, but I'm coming for you. And when I do, it'll be the last mistake you ever make." The line went dead. But Malik knew one thing for sure. The war was on. The phone call hung in the air like a heavy fog. Malik stood still for a moment, the weight of the words sinking in. The broker had just acknowledged them. For all their careful planning, it was clear now. They had drawn attention. But it wasn't just attention. It was the kind of attention that would put them directly in the crosshairs. Ethan, sensing the shift, stepped closer, his expression tense. "What did he say?" Malik didn't answer immediately. He looked at the photo in his hand again, the face of the man next to the broker burning into his mind. It was a piece of the puzzle, a key that would unlock the rest of the operation. But now they were no longer just hunters. They were prey. "He knows we're here," Malik finally said, his voice steady despite the undercurrent of urgency. "And he's not going to let us walk away this time." Ethan's eyes hardened. "So, what now?" Malik met his gaze, then glanced back at the cluttered desk, the folders, the photographs. The weight of it all felt suffocating. They were so close, yet it felt like they were in a race against time. "We have to move fast," Malik said, his mind already calculating their next steps. "We've got a lead on Marcus Trent, And this, he waved the photograph in the air, is the connection we need to finally take down the broker. We're not going to sit back and let him pull the strings any longer. Ethan nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Then let's go. We need to get this info to the right people. They gathered the documents and made their way out of the office. The warehouse was eerily quiet now, a stark contrast to the tension they just walked through. Every step they took felt like an echo in the silence. As they reached the door, Malik held up a hand, signaling for Ethan to stop. His instincts told him something wasn't right. There was a car parked outside now, black, sleek, and unmistakable. It wasn't the kind of vehicle you missed. The ominous presence of it sent a ripple of unease through Malik. The broker's people had already started closing in. "Stay low," Malik ordered, his voice sharp. "We need to get out of here quietly." Ethan nodded, and they moved quickly but silently, sticking to the shadows. They made their way to the car, every instinct screaming that time was running out. Malik's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at the screen. A message from Slick. "I've been tracking movements. The broker knows you're onto him. He's sending people after you. Be careful." Malik cursed under his breath, his grip tightening on the wheel as he and Ethan slid into the car. "We're being hunted," Malik muttered, more to himself than to Ethan. Ethan's hand hovered near his own phone. "Should we go to the police? Bring in reinforcements?" Malik shook his head. "No time. We need to keep this between us for now. If we go public, the broker will scatter like cockroaches. We'll never catch him." They sped through the streets, their minds racing with strategies and escape plans. But no matter how fast they drove, the feeling of being hunted never left them. Every street corner, every passing car seemed to be a potential threat. As they neared a secluded part of town, Malik's phone rang again. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize. He answered cautiously. "Malik Harris," he said, his tone guarded. A calm voice on the other end replied, "You've been busy, Mr. Harris. You're making it harder to stay hidden." Malik froze, his grip tightening on the wheel. The voice was familiar, but it took him a second to place it. When it hit him, his blood ran cold. "Marcus Trent," Malik said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "I should have known you were behind this." Trent chuckled, a low, mirthless sound. "You're not as clever as you think, Harris. You've dug yourself into a hole, and now you'll have to climb out of it. But don't worry, I'll be waiting." The line went dead. Malik's jaw clenched. The walls were closing in, and they had just made themselves the target of one of the most dangerous men in the game. "Ethan," Malik said, his voice calm but filled with an urgency that wouldn't be ignored. "We need to get off the grid. Now." They didn't have much time. The broker was going to make his move, and Malik could feel it in his bones. He wasn't going to stop until he had them both. But Malik had lived through far worse, and he wasn't about to let a criminal mastermind take him down now. They turned into a narrow alley, pulling the car into the shadows. Malik quickly checked his phone, scanning the messages and contacts he had. The only way out now was to follow the trail wherever it led. The broker may have been playing chess, but Malik had his own moves to make. Malik's finger hovered over the screen for a moment before dialing the number of the only person he trusted to help them now. Slick was a shadow in this world, always one step ahead of the game. If there was anyone who could help them escape the broker's reach, it was him. As the phone rang, Malik glanced at Ethan, who was already preparing for the worst. He couldn't afford to lose his grandson now, not when they were so close. "Slick," Malik said when the line finally connected, "I need your help. We're in too deep, and I need to disappear. We need cover, and we need it fast." Slick's voice crackled through the line. "I figured you might need me soon. I've got a safe house set up. You two get there, and don't stop for anything. They're tracking you, Malik. You can't stay in one place for long." Malik hung up without another word, then started the engine and sped out of the alley. The night was dark, but the road ahead seemed a little clearer now. There was still a long way to go, and the danger was far from over. But Malik had one thing in mind now: survival. And if the broker thought he could break him, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. The car raced through the streets, its engine growling like an animal desperate to escape its captors. Malik's grip on the wheel tightened with every turn, his eyes scanning every rearview mirror, every shadow that seemed to flicker in the corners of his vision. He could feel it. The broker's reach was tightening around them. The clock was ticking, and they had no choice but to run. Ethan was quiet beside him, his face set in a determined expression. It wasn't fear that gripped him. It was the same quiet resolve that Malik had come to recognize. His grandson had inherited more than his sharp mind. He had inherited his spirit, a spirit that refused to be broken, no matter how heavy the odds. As they approached the outskirts of the city, Malik's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from Slick. Safe house in 10. Don't stop until you get there. I've got eyes everywhere. Don't trust anyone but me. Malik barely had time to process the message before he turned the car onto a darkened road. The city lights were far behind them now, and the only illumination came from the occasional flicker of streetlights and the distant glow of a fading sunset. He knew they were being watched. There were too many variables at play, too many hidden eyes in the shadows. The safe house was supposed to be their sanctuary, but Malik knew better. There was no such thing as safety when you were up against someone like the broker. It wasn't about where you were. It was about who knew you were there. We need to make sure Slick's not compromised, Malik muttered, more to himself than to Ethan. Ethan nodded. I'll keep an eye on the surroundings. If anyone tries to follow us, I'll see them first. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, a never-ending blur of darkness. But eventually, Malik saw the faint outline of a house in the distance, small, isolated, and with no neighbors for miles. Slick had come through. They slowed as they approached the property, Malik's eyes flicking back and forth between the house and the surrounding landscape. No cars in sight. No movement. Just the quiet hum of the night. Malik pulled up to the small, unassuming house and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched even when you weren't. Malik got out of the car first, then turned to help Ethan out. As they made their way toward the house, Malik's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Malik Harris, he said, his voice flat, not giving away any hint of what he was feeling. A pause on the other end, and then the voice came, cold and unmistakable. You think you can run, Malik? Marcus Trent's voice was low, calm, like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. You can't hide forever. I know where you are, and I'm coming for you. Malik's blood ran cold. He had expected retaliation, but the fact that Trent was speaking so directly meant only one thing. He had eyes on them. This was no longer a game of cat and mouse. It was war. You won't get me, Malik said, his voice tight with anger and resolve. But you will regret crossing me. Trent laughed, a low chuckle that made the hairs on the back of Malik's neck stand on end. We'll see, old man. We'll see. The call ended abruptly. Malik stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle over him. The broker, Marcus Trent, his men, they were all closing in. But for the first time in a long while, Malik felt something stir within him. He was not done yet. Ethan was already at the door of the house, knocking 3 times in quick succession. Slick had made sure to leave a clear signal, and it was exactly what they needed. No hesitation, no second-guessing. Just action. The door creaked open, revealing a shadowy figure in the doorway. It was Slick, his face partially obscured by the low light from inside. You two look like you've been through hell, Slick said, his voice gruff but carrying that familiar sense of control. Get in. We don't have time to waste. Malik stepped inside, followed by Ethan. The interior of the house was simple, modest furnishings, a small kitchen tucked in the corner, a desk stacked with papers, a few old chairs. But it was safe. For now. Slick locked the door behind them, his eyes scanning the surroundings before he spoke again. Got everything you need? He asked, his gaze shifting to the bags they had carried with them. Malik nodded. We need to move fast. Trent knows we're on his tail. Slick nodded grimly. That's what I figured. I've been keeping an eye on things. The broker's boys have been trying to track your movements. They're on your trail, but they haven't figured out where you are yet. Malik exhaled slowly, trying to clear his mind. What's the next move? Slick paced for a moment before answering. You need to hit them first. Take down Trent, and the broker will crumble. But you've got to do it fast. He's not the type to wait around. Ethan spoke up, his voice low but filled with determination. We know where Trent's been hiding. We've got the connection. We just need the right people to back us up. Malik's gaze flicked to Slick. You know anyone we can trust? Slick considered this for a moment before nodding. I've got a few friends who owe me favors. They're not the type to ask questions. But you need to move quick. We don't have much time. Malik's thoughts were already racing. They were closing in on Marcus Trent, but the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. He couldn't afford any more mistakes. All right, Malik said, his voice firm. We go in. We hit hard, and we end this. No turning back now. Slick turned toward the door, opening it just enough to look outside. We'll need to be careful. They're watching everything. Malik nodded, feeling the tension rise. It was a long shot, but they had no other choice. If they didn't act now, they might never get another chance. Slick turned to them one last time before leading them down a narrow hallway. Let's move. The clock's ticking. They followed him into the shadows, and for a moment, it felt like they were walking toward something that couldn't be undone. The dim lights of the safe house flickered as Malik and Ethan gathered their gear. Slick had arranged for them to meet a few trusted allies who could help them take down Marcus Trent once and for all. The tension in the room was palpable. The calm before the storm. Malik felt it deep in his bones. This was the moment that would decide everything. Are we ready? Malik asked, turning to Ethan. His grandson was loading his small bag with whatever supplies they could carry, maps, phones, and a few other tools Slick had provided. Ethan didn't answer immediately, his eyes focused on the task at hand. But when he finally met Malik's gaze, the fire in his eyes was unmistakable. We're ready. Slick stepped forward, his face grim. He looked like a man who had seen his share of battles, both physical and mental. We've got intel on Trent's location. He's holed up in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. We can hit him tonight, or we risk him moving. Malik nodded, feeling the weight of the decision. Time was no longer on their side. If they waited, Trent and his men would slip away, regroup, and come at them harder. No, they had to strike now. The phone buzzed in Malik's pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from Slick's contact. Trent's inside. He's not expecting a hit tonight. Move fast. Move silent. Malik's eyes narrowed. It was time to put everything on the line. We go now, Malik said, his voice low and steady. No hesitation. No turning back. Slick led the way out the back of the house, and the three of them piled into the car. The drive to the warehouse was quiet. The only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of papers as they double-checked their plans. When they arrived, Slick slowed the car to a crawl. They parked a few blocks away to avoid drawing attention. Malik could see the outline of the warehouse in the distance, tall, dark, and foreboding. The kind of place where deals went down, where enemies disappeared without a trace. This is it, Slick whispered. We stick to the plan. Malik, Ethan, you take the front. I'll cover the rear. We move in, and we don't leave anyone alive. Malik nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just a mission, it was a reckoning. Trent had crossed a line, and Malik wasn't going to let him or his gang walk away unscathed. They approached the warehouse with the stealth of shadows, the crunch of gravel beneath their boots barely audible in the night air. As they neared the entrance, Malik's senses heightened. His years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The silence was too perfect, too still. Something's off, Malik muttered, stopping just short of the door. Slick, who had been scanning the perimeter, held up a hand. Stay alert. They're expecting us. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from inside the warehouse. Malik tensed, signaling to Ethan and Slick. They took cover behind a large container, their breaths shallow as they listened. It was hard to make out the conversation, but the tone was unmistakable. They think they can take us down? The voice was low and sneering, Trent's voice. Let's show them what happens when you challenge the wrong people. Malik's blood ran cold. They had walked right into a trap. Get ready, Slick whispered, his voice a mere breath against the tension in the air. We need to move now. Without another word, They rushed to the door, flanking it. Malik kicked it open, his heart pounding as the sound of the door crashing against the wall reverberated through the warehouse. Inside, the shadows were thick, and the scent of oil and rust filled the air. The men inside were already reaching for their guns, but they weren't quick enough. Malik and Ethan fired in sync, precise, methodical. They moved like they had been doing this for years, their bodies working in perfect harmony. Slick wasn't far behind, covering their backs as they cleared the room. The sounds of gunfire echoed through the warehouse, but it was over quickly. The gang members, unprepared for such a swift assault, fell one by one. But Trent wasn't there. The three of them moved deeper into the warehouse, their footsteps quiet but purposeful. The dim lighting flickered as they passed row after row of crates, their eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the far end of the warehouse. "You think you've won, Malik? You're too late." Malik's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the voice instantly. It was Marcus Trent. He motioned for Slick and Ethan to stay behind him as they approached the voice. It was coming from a small office at the back. The door cracked open just enough to reveal a shadowy figure. "Trent," Malik called out, his voice a low growl. "It's over." The door slammed open, and there stood Marcus Trent, flanked by two of his biggest men. Trent's eyes gleamed with malice, his smirk never wavering. "You think you can walk out of here alive?" Trent sneered. "You're just an old man and a kid. You don't stand a chance." Malik's eyes narrowed, the fire inside him burning brighter than ever. "I've been fighting my whole life, Trent. I've survived worse than you." Without warning, Trent's men lunged forward, but Malik was faster. He ducked under the first punch, delivering a brutal knee to the man's stomach, sending him crashing to the ground. Ethan moved with practiced speed, disarming the second man in one swift motion. Trent watched in stunned silence as his men were taken down one by one. His smug expression faltered for the first time. "You can't hide behind your goons forever," Malik said, stepping forward, his voice steady. "This is between you and me." Trent's eyes flashed with fury, but he didn't move. He knew he had lost. The fight had been taken out of him. Slick entered the room, standing beside Malik. "You're done, Trent. The broker's not going to save you." Trent's face twisted with rage as he looked from one face to another, but deep down, he knew it was over. He had underestimated the one man who had been waiting for this moment his entire life. Malik took one last step forward, his hand tightening into a fist. "This is for everyone you've hurt, and it's for me." With that, the room fell silent. The tension in the air was thick, as if the very warehouse walls could feel the weight of the moment. Marcus Trent stood there, his expression twisted between anger and disbelief. For the first time, he seemed unsure, exposed, as if the years of cruelty and manipulation had all been for nothing. The power he thought he held had crumbled before him. Malik's breath was steady, controlled. He had spent decades in the trenches, faced death more times than he could count, and yet this moment, standing face to face with the man who had orchestrated so much pain, felt different, personal. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about justice. Slick moved closer, his gaze unwavering as he looked Trent up and down. "You should have known, Trent. You never take a fight to the wrong people. And you definitely don't mess with Malik Harris." Ethan, standing a few paces behind Malik, wasn't saying much, but his eyes were locked on Trent. Malik could sense the mixture of resolve and anger in his grandson. Ethan had seen the horrors of the world, but this, watching his grandfather face down the very enemy they'd hunted for weeks, was something else. It was a defining moment. "I told you," Malik spoke calmly, yet every word carried the weight of a lifetime. "You've crossed a line. You've hurt too many people, too many families. You thought you could control everything, but you didn't count on one thing: resilience." Trent's eyes flickered with contempt. He glanced at the two men still lying on the floor, incapacitated by Malik and Ethan. He was no longer the man in charge. He was the man on the run, desperate, broken. "You think this is over?" Trent spat, his voice thick with venom. "You think you've won?" Malik's gaze never wavered, his voice low but powerful. "It's over when I say it's over." Slick stepped forward, a gun in his hand, its barrel aimed directly at Trent. "We've got what we came for. The cops are on their way, and you're done. All of it's coming down. The money, the connections, the lies. You're finished." Trent's expression flickered for a moment, defeat, regret, then anger again. His lips curled into a snarl. "You can't take everything from me. I have people in high places. I can make this disappear." Malik laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "No, Trent. You can't make it disappear. Not this time. You've been playing games with the wrong people for too long." Suddenly, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, closer. Malik knew their time was running out, but it didn't matter. This was it, the final chapter of a long story. Trent wasn't walking away from this one. The law would handle the rest. As the sirens neared, Trent's arrogance started to fade, replaced with panic. He took a step back, his eyes darting around the warehouse as if searching for an escape. But there was no escape now. Not for him. Malik had made sure of that. "You're not going anywhere," Malik said, his voice colder than before. "The law will catch up to you. If not them, someone else will." For a long moment, Trent didn't respond. His shoulders slumped, his tough exterior cracking as the reality of his situation set in. His empire had collapsed, and there was no one left to protect him. Slick exchanged a look with Malik. It was time. Malik reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted phone, a gift from an old contact. He pressed a few buttons, and the screen lit up with a single message. "Trent's finished. Move in." The reply came seconds later. "Copy. We're on it." The final domino had fallen. Slick gave Malik a quick nod. "Let's go. We've got what we came for. The rest will handle itself." Malik didn't hesitate. He turned and motioned for Ethan to follow him. The sounds of approaching sirens were now deafening, signaling the end of this chapter. As the three of them moved towards the exit, Slick shot one last glance at Marcus Trent, who was now pacing, defeated. Slick's eyes were cold. "I wouldn't want to be you right now, Trent." Malik smiled grimly. "I wouldn't want to be you either." They made their way to the car, and as the engine roared to life, Malik allowed himself a moment of reflection. This battle had taken everything. His body, his spirit, his resolve had been tested beyond measure. But in the end, he had triumphed, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been oppressed, hurt, or left behind by men like Marcus Trent. As the car sped off into the night, Malik's thoughts turned to what came next. There was still much to be done, much more that needed fixing. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace settling over him. He had made a stand, and it had been enough. Ethan looked at his grandfather, his face lit by the glow of the dashboard. "What happens now, Grandpa?" Malik glanced at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Now, we go home. We rest. And then, we make sure nothing like this ever happens again." The road ahead was uncertain, but Malik knew one thing for sure. As long as he was breathing, he would fight for what was right. For justice, for his family, and for everyone who had ever been silenced. They drove into the night, the future waiting for them just beyond the horizon. The world felt different now. The steady hum of the city was a stark contrast to the adrenaline-fueled chaos of just hours ago. The fight for justice had been long and hard, but the war wasn't over, not by a long shot. Malik knew that even as he sat back in his favorite chair at home, with his grandson Ethan sitting quietly nearby, there was still work to be done. The phone call earlier had been a lifeline, an unexpected yet crucial piece of the puzzle that had tipped the scales in their favor. Malik had spent a lifetime working the system, dodging the consequences of his actions, and bending the rules to survive. But now, with Marcus Trent behind bars and the law finally taking its due course, it was different. He could feel it in the air. This time, there would be no walking away from the wreckage. The consequences would catch up with all those involved. Ethan's voice broke the silence. "So, what happens to the rest of them? The people Trent worked with?" Malik's eyes narrowed slightly as he thought about the question. The battle had been won, but there were still pieces of the puzzle scattered around the city. Marcus Trent hadn't been operating alone, far from it. There were still figures in the shadows, People who had been in on it all along. Malik didn't need to look hard to know who they were. That's the next step, Malik said, his voice steady but laced with a sense of purpose. We don't just let them slip away. We keep pushing. People like Trent don't get to walk free just because they're behind bars. Ethan nodded, his gaze intense. You mean the people who helped him, the ones who thought they were untouchable? Exactly, Malik replied, leaning back in his chair. We make sure they know they're not invincible. They can run, hide, think they're safe, but they're not. It's time we start taking down the real network behind all this corruption. The thought of dismantling the empire that Trent had built, piece by piece, was almost poetic. Malik had seen his fair share of battles, but this one was different. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something much bigger. It was about ensuring the next generation, Ethan's generation, didn't have to face the same monsters that Malik had spent his life battling. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Ethan stood and walked over, opening it to reveal Slick, his face drawn and serious. Malik stood up to greet him, sensing the weight in the air. Something's wrong? Malik asked, his voice steady but with a hint of concern. Slick nodded, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Yeah, we got a problem. There's a new player in town, someone else pulling strings. We thought we had everything locked down, but there's someone else trying to take Trent's place. Malik's stomach tightened. Just when he thought things were clearing up, another storm was on the horizon. Who? Slick hesitated, his eyes flicking to Ethan, then back to Malik. A name's come up, Raymond Carter. He's been low-key, but he's been making moves, powerful ones. Malik felt his jaw tighten. Raymond Carter was a name he'd heard before. A shadow, lurking just out of reach. A figure with connections so deep, it was rumored he could make or break anyone in the city. This is what I've been afraid of, Malik muttered. More to himself than anyone else. Trent was just a pawn in a much bigger game. You know it, Slick confirmed. And Carter's not like Trent. He's smarter, more elusive. We need to move fast, Malik. If we don't, we might be facing an even bigger problem than we just took down. Malik's mind raced. For years, he had fought to make a life for himself and his family. But this was the fight of his life. He couldn't let Carter slip through the cracks like all the others. All right, Malik said, his voice now firm with resolve. We're not wasting any time. Get me everything you can on Carter. I'll handle the rest. Slick nodded, turning to leave. Before he walked out, he paused at the door, looking back at Malik. You sure about this? This guy's not someone you want to mess with. Malik's eyes met his, unwavering. I didn't come this far to stop now. It's time to take him down, once and for all. As Slick left, the weight of the next step settled heavily on Malik's shoulders. He had thought that after everything, after all the sacrifices and struggles, he would finally be able to rest. But there was no rest for warriors like him. The fight was never truly over. There was always another battle, another enemy lurking in the shadows. Ethan stood by his side, his expression serious. Grandpa, are you sure we can take him down? Carter's got a reputation. Malik placed a reassuring hand on his grandson's shoulder. It's not about taking him down, Ethan. It's about making sure he knows he can't get away with this. He thinks he's untouchable? Let's show him that no one is. The future was uncertain, but Malik was ready. He had made it through worse, and he wasn't about to let some new shadow in the city take what was his. Not now, not ever. With his resolve solidified, Malik turned to the window. The city skyline spread out before him like a battlefield. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The night was thick with tension, the air alive with the quiet hum of uncertainty. Malik had never been one to fear the unknown, but even he could feel the weight of what was coming. Raymond Carter wasn't a man to be underestimated. He had spent years building an empire, quietly, methodically, and ruthlessly. And now, Malik was determined to tear it down, piece by piece. The following morning, Malik sat at his kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. Ethan sat across from him, his eyes focused on a laptop screen filled with the intel they had managed to gather on Carter. Slick had delivered the first batch of information, but it was far from complete. Every step they took seemed to open up more questions than answers. Here, Ethan said, his finger hovering over the screen. This is where Carter's been making his moves. The docks, the warehouses. He's got operations all over the city, Malik. And it's not just small-time stuff. These are big players, people who have been around for decades. Malik leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Looks like we've got a maze to navigate. And with people like Carter, the deeper you go, the more dangerous it gets. Ethan nodded, his expression grim. But it's not just about the money anymore. Carter's got something else. Connections. People in high places. That's what I was afraid of, Malik muttered. He'd known from the beginning that Carter wasn't just another thug trying to take over the streets. He had bigger ambitions. And with those ambitions came power. The kind of power that could make or break careers, ruin lives, and corrupt everything it touched. The sound of a car engine revving outside caught Malik's attention. He glanced out the window to see Slick pulling up in his truck, his face tight with concern. When Slick entered, he wasted no time with pleasantries. "We've got a problem," Slick said, his voice low. "Carter's aware we're after him. I don't know how, but he knows. His men are looking for you, Malik. It's a matter of time before they show up at your door." Malik's pulse quickened, but his expression didn't change. "I've been expecting something like this. It's not the first time someone's come after me." Slick shook his head. "This is different. They're not just sending anyone after you. They've got professionals. People who won't stop until you're gone." Malik met his gaze, calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "Then we give them a reason to stop. They want to come after me? They're going to find out just how much they're messing with." Ethan looked between them, his brow furrowing. "What are you planning?" Malik stood up, moving toward the back door of the house. "It's time to go on the offensive." Slick followed him. "What do you mean?" "I mean we stop hiding. We start making them feel the heat. It's not just Carter we need to worry about. It's the network of people who've been enabling him, and I intend to make them all feel the pressure." Ethan stood, his voice firm. "I'm in. Whatever you need me to do." Malik's eyes softened for a moment, a fleeting smile passing over his face. "You don't have to get involved, son. This is my fight." "No," Ethan said, shaking his head. "I'm in this with you. We've come this far. I'm not backing out now." Malik didn't argue. He knew Ethan was more than capable of handling himself, and if it came down to it, he'd rather have him by his side than not. The next few hours were spent preparing, gathering supplies, assembling their team, and making the necessary connections to get them into Carter's inner circle. It was dangerous work, but Malik had always thrived in dangerous environments. And now, with everything on the line, there was no room for hesitation. As dusk began to fall, Malik, Slick, and Ethan made their way to the docks, the heart of Carter's operation. The place was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the usual chaos that reigned there. The warehouses loomed in the distance, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. "This is it," Malik said, his voice low and steady. "We go in, we hit them hard, and we send Carter a message." Slick nodded, adjusting his jacket. "You got the plan?" Malik smiled coldly. "Yeah, we go straight for Carter's right-hand man first. Once he's out of the picture, the rest of his operation will fall apart." Ethan swallowed hard, but his determination was clear. "Let's do this." They approached the first warehouse cautiously, their steps deliberate and silent. The air was thick with tension as they neared the entrance. Malik glanced at Ethan and Slick, giving them a silent nod. It was time to take action. As the door creaked open, a sudden burst of gunfire rang out, followed by shouting. Malik's heart raced, but he didn't flinch. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had no choice but to move forward. The chaos erupted as they stormed the warehouse. Slick was the first to react, taking down 2 guards with swift precision. Malik followed, his mind focused, his movements sharp and calculated. Every step they took brought them closer to their target. Finally, they reached the back office, where Malik knew Carter's right-hand man, Vince, would be waiting. The door burst open, and Vince spun around, his hand reaching for his weapon. Malik was faster. With a single shot, Vince was down, his body crumpling to the ground in a heap. "Message sent," Malik muttered. looking down at the man who had been instrumental in Carter's rise to power. Slick nodded, his breath heavy. Now we deal with the rest. The warehouse was silent except for the distant sound of sirens in the background. The battle had only just begun, but Malik knew one thing for certain. Carter was no longer in control. The city was his again. The city felt different now, charged, like a storm ready to break. Malik stood in the dimly lit alley outside the warehouse, the weight of the night settling on his shoulders. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, but the reality of what he'd done had begun to sink in. The right-hand man was down. Carter's operation had been shaken to its core. But Malik knew the real test was yet to come. "We've done what we had to," Slick said, his voice steady but edged with anticipation. "But Carter's not going to go down without a fight. He'll be gunning for you now, Malik." Malik didn't respond right away. He was scanning the street ahead, his sharp eyes catching every shadow, every movement. His mind was working at full speed, calculating the next steps. They had one advantage: surprise. But how long would it last? Ethan stood beside him, his face tense. "So what's the next move? We hit the rest of his operation?" Malik turned to face his grandson, his gaze softening for a moment. "We could, but we need to hit Carter where it hurts. It's time to go straight for the source." Slick raised an eyebrow. "The big man himself?" Malik nodded. "He'll be expecting us to come after his people, but he won't expect us to come straight to him. It's time to finish this." The three of them shared a look of resolve, knowing that the path they were about to take would leave no room for retreat. They had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. The trip to Carter's mansion was a quiet one, the weight of the night pressing down on all of them. Malik sat in the back seat, his mind running through every possibility, every outcome. He'd been to war before, but this was different. This wasn't a battle for survival. It was a battle for redemption. Carter had built his empire on fear, on manipulation, and on violence. But Malik had something Carter didn't: integrity. And with that came the strength to break free from the cycle of power and oppression that had defined their lives for far too long. As they approached the mansion, the towering gates came into view, and Malik's grip tightened on the seat. The mansion itself was a fortress, a symbol of Carter's wealth and control. But Malik wasn't intimidated. He had been through worse, seen worse. And now, it was his turn to tear it all down. "We go in fast and quiet," Malik said, his voice low. "No mistakes. This ends tonight." Slick gave a quick nod, his hand already on the door handle. Ethan, though, hesitated. "Malik, this is it, isn't it? There's no turning back after this." Malik met his grandson's gaze, his eyes steady. "There's no turning back. But that doesn't mean we're alone. You've got me, and I've got you. We're in this together." Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath. Together. The mansion was even more intimidating up close. The heavy iron gates stood like sentinels, and the high walls around the estate gave it the feel of a fortress. But Malik wasn't worried about the walls. He was worried about what was inside, Carter's last line of defense. They moved swiftly, using the cover of darkness to approach the mansion's back entrance. Malik's instincts were razor-sharp, honed over years of facing danger head-on. Every movement felt purposeful, every step deliberate. As they reached the back door, Malik signaled for them to stop. He knelt down, checking the locks, listening carefully for any sounds inside. "Ready?" Slick whispered. "Always," Malik replied. He pushed open the door with a quiet creak, and they slipped inside. The mansion was eerily silent, the only sound being the faint hum of electricity running through the walls. They crept down the hallways, their footsteps muffled by the plush carpet beneath them. Malik's heart raced as they neared the main office, the room where Carter would likely be. The plan was simple: get to Carter, end the threat. But Malik couldn't help but feel a strange pull, a sense of foreboding that came with the final confrontation. This was no longer just about justice. It was about confronting everything that had brought him to this moment. They reached the door of the office, and Malik pushed it open without a sound. Carter was sitting behind his desk, looking every bit the businessman, calm, collected, and in control. But Malik saw through the mask. He saw the fear in Carter's eyes, the subtle tension in his posture that betrayed the confidence he tried so hard to project. "Malik," Carter said, his voice cold, but with a hint of uncertainty. "I knew you'd come eventually. You always did like to play the hero." Malik stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not here to play games. This ends now." Carter smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You really think you've won? You've made a lot of noise, Malik, but you're nothing more than a relic. A faded memory." Malik didn't flinch. "The only thing fading is your empire. You built it on fear, Carter. And now, that fear is going to tear it all down." Before Carter could respond, Malik made his move. In a flash, he was at the desk, his hand gripping Carter by the collar, lifting him out of the chair. The man's face twisted in shock, but Malik wasn't interested in his surprise. "This is how it ends," Malik said, his voice low and firm. "You're done." The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, but for Malik, the world had already narrowed to this moment, the confrontation, the reckoning. As Carter struggled, trying to break free, Malik knew one thing for sure. There would be no more hiding, no more running. The battle for control had ended. And now, it was time for Malik to claim his victory.